Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to your Thursday edition of Pelicans Daily, brought to you by Fan Arch. I'm your host, David Grubb, editor in chief of thebirdrights.com. And on Wednesday, the New Orleans Pelicans made it official with the announcement that Joe Dumars would be the next executive vice president of basketball operations for the New Orleans Pelicans. In a statement released by the team governor Gail Benson basically went through the reasons why Dumars, in her opinion, is the man for the job, citing his experience as a player and his front office experience as well, his character and leadership, citing his relationships at the league office and their time working together at meetings over the past several years. Um, for Dumars, the statement in particular goes on to what he was looking for, what he will be looking for as far as building a new version of the New Orleans Pelicans. And his vision includes, quote unquote, building a disciplined team that is built on toughness, smart decision making, and a no excuses mindset. I mean, if you're familiar with the type of teams that Joe Dumars played on as a professional with the Detroit Pistons, as a member of the Bad Boys in the late '80s and '90s, um, or if you want to talk about the teams that he built in Detroit in the early 2000s, that's what they were about: toughness, smart decision making, and no excuses. Um, Certainly that is not the impression that people have about the New Orleans Pelicans, both on the court and in the front office over the past several years. I think going beyond, I don't think it's fair to blame just David Griffin for those things. The decision making by the Pelicans, this goes beyond David Griffin. It goes beyond Dell Demps. Certainly, some of that criticism for some bad decision making has to extend to the folks in the C suites as well, who make the decisions on Airline Highway about this franchise. And of course, he talks about reconnecting with the community and those types of things as well. Um, it's still very, very difficult, I think, for a lot of fans to understand what's going on with this franchise, even if they like Joe Dumars. I mean, and certainly as a Louisiana native, people are going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Excuse me. But as we talked about yesterday, the process gives people a lot of pause first and foremost. Just the fact that the Pelicans did not meet with anyone else, basically, that this and the reports that this has basically been going on since January, when as Shamit Dua from In the Know said that David Griffin wanted to get rid of Willie Green. And at that point, that basically broke the relationship between him and Gail Benson and Dennis Lauscher and Mickey Loomis and that side. And that they decided essentially that they would rather have Willie than David Griffin. And so they started these conversations, I believe, because you don't make this decision this quickly unless you've had these conversations already. So in my mind, basically what happened was the Pelicans had decided we're done with David Griffin. We're going to look in a different direction. And they pivoted back to Joe Dumars, who was one of the finalists for the job before Griffin was named 6 years ago. That's fine and dandy if you want to do that. But I still think that the process itself is flawed. And then when you look at Dumars's record as well, there are a lot of things that make you hesitant. The Pelicans, for their part, are doing what teams do. They're going to show you all the great things about his career. The fact that as a player, he won two championships, that he was named to all-star teams, that he was an all NBA player, that he went to played for the Olympics. Um, and that he's a Hall of Famer. And then they're also going to talk to you about the Sportsmanship Award. They're going to talk to you about his time at the early years in Detroit, where over those first 8 seasons, they had um, 50, 750-win seasons, and you go to the playoffs. You make 6 trips to the Eastern Conference Finals. You go twice to the NBA Finals, and you win a world championship by beating, the Los Angeles Lakers. All those things are great. All those things are great. But in 14 seasons as an executive, you have to take all of the record. And the last part of his career with Detroit was abysmal. Whether it was trades that didn't work, whether it was drafting, and he did a poor job drafting, and the on-court results. The lack of winning. And not just they weren't even mediocre, they were bad. A lot of sub 30 win seasons. Um, he churned through 9 coaches in 14 years. 9 different coaches in 14 years. That is a cause for concern for an organization that is lacks stability in the New Orleans Pelicans. you're gonna if you know all these things make you question Dumars's judgment in that regard. Now, the reports are that Dumars is going to retain Bryson Graham as general manager. And that's good news because Bryson has been the guy at the forefront of drafting players for the New Orleans Pelicans. No word on what Swin Cash's status is at this point, but I don't expect Swin to be leaving if Bryson is staying. And that Joe is already assembling a team of folks that he had worked with in Detroit. But again, I would say, are you happy with reassembling a team of executives that did not have a good run over a significant portion of their tenure in Detroit? Bringing those people together. Look, if expanding the staff was one thing, adding more people was one thing, I think we would all be happy with that. I think you want to see the Pelicans continue to add to their front office. They need more faces in the building. It's been reported several times that the Pelicans still have one of the smallest basketball operations staffs in the entire NBA. Even relative to other small market teams, their staff is significantly smaller. This is also a team that has not paid coaches very well. The average now, the going rate seems to be around $7 million for a quality head coach. Willie Green gets paid maybe $2 million, though the terms of his last contract extension were not revealed. The word around the league is that it's somewhere around $2 million. That's a significant gap. Gail Benson touts the fact that she spent a lot of money on the Pelicans, but for the wealthiest person in the state of Louisiana, there's a lot more money to be spent when it comes to this franchise. Like just increasing the spending from bare minimum, it seems that the franchise wants a lot of credit for that. And you don't really get credit for that. That's the job. When you buy a team and you're making obscene amounts of revenue, including state subsidies, then the fans expect you to spend money in return. So you don't get a pat on the back for spending the basic amounts of money for upkeep of your franchise or keeping up with the other teams in the league, because you're still not doing that. And you can cite the reasons that the city of New Orleans doesn't have a large Fortune 500 corporation base. It doesn't have a lot of deep pockets in the area. But NBA teams are not losing money. This is a team that was bought for somewhere around, under 400 million, but is now worth probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion. If that's the case, if the Pelicans are going to continue to cry cash poor and have an inability to spend money, then maybe it's time for Gail Benson to think about selling the team. But the reports, again, by Shamit Dua, and I give him so much credit for this, is that this team has had offers on the table from folks who would keep the team in New Orleans, but that they're waiting for the windfall that comes with the next round of expansion. So if you think about the two teams that could be coming on potentially, let's say Las Vegas and Seattle, because we know the NBA wants to get back in Seattle. And we know that there's a heavy interest in Las Vegas right now in sports, with the Major League Baseball already there, with the NFL already there. So, and hockey already there. The NBA is the only major sport not in Vegas now. So they want to be a part of that action. If that's the case, then that's a potential additional 300 million in Gail Benson's pocket as part of the expansion fees that come in for the next team. Well, if that's the case, if that's what you're waiting on, then you're keeping the fans, you're keeping the organization in kind of like a strange area where you're not going to do too much because you're waiting for this other money, but you're also not going and that means you're not going to do what it takes to really make this team competitive. And I think that's what fans ultimately want to know, is if there's a commitment to really be a winner. And the only way to do that in professional sports is by spending money. You don't have to have the highest payroll in the league. You don't have to have spent the most money in the league, but you got to spend it. You've got to be competitive in your spending, and you got to spend your money wisely and in the right places. And I don't think anybody would say by and large that that's what's been done in New Orleans. I understand why fans are upset. I understand why the backlash is there, because I think as media members, we're surprised that the Pelicans went through this process so quickly. And I think there are going to be some very, straightforward questions asked by folks when the introductory press conference is held on Tuesday, the 22nd, both for the organization and for Dumars. Because I think on the one hand, you're really going to want to understand why the organization felt it had to make this move so quickly. If Dumars was your guy, I think that you still had time to make this move. He's at the NBA office. There wasn't a demand from other teams. I don't think anybody else was pursuing Joe Dumars in particular. So I think you had the time to go out and talk to other people and find out what other ideas they were. If the league pushed this as they have before, I think you're taking advantage of an owner who doesn't really understand basketball, an ownership group that doesn't understand how basketball needs to work and is afraid to do anything other than what looks good on paper in the moment. I think even when you go back to the hiring of Griffin, it was one of those things that felt like it looked really good at the moment. But I don't know how many folks were particularly thinking that Griffin was the guy to go out and get. I know when a lot of the stories that I wrote at the time, that wasn't the particular executive that I was looking for. I was thinking about guys like Troy Weaver. And I think Trajan Langdon, even as he got the subordinate role, was viewed as somebody who could handle the whole thing as he is in Detroit and giving them the biggest single season turnaround in their franchise's history, undoing a lot of the damage that had been done by Dumars, quite frankly. Because the Pistons have been bad ever since he made them bad. And it finally took uh, Trajan Langdon to turn them around this season. That part, I think, needs to be examined and questioned a lot further and a lot deeper. And we'll see what that if that happens on the 22nd. Um, One of the other stories that comes out is that Dumars is under an edict to trade Zion Williamson, and that is a huge undertaking at this time in Zion's career. If the Pelicans are really going to trade Zion Williamson, the market right now, I don't think, is in the Pelicans' favor. Because once again, like you did with the Brandon Ingram trade, you're now going into a position where everyone knows you're trying to get off a distressed asset. If you're trading Zion Williamson now, it's because people will know that it's because you don't want him, not because you're looking for a great value. You are trying to get rid of a problem. And in these situations, in my experience and just observing, what happens is when you make these kinds of trades, you're trading for someone else's problem. You're going to end up trading for someone else's problem, or because you're trading your problem, you have to take back lesser value. Teams are not going to be kicking and falling over themselves to give you a super high price for something that they know you don't really want at all. And so for the Pelicans, you've given away your leverage at this stage. And I think when you look at this, you've also taken some teams off the market because there are places that you absolutely cannot trade Zion Williamson to. You can't trade him within the division. You probably don't want to trade him within the West in particular. And so what teams are likely available? And I think that if you're talking about what teams could be potentially available, you start with the Chicago Bulls, who you've had a trade relationship with in the past. The Bulls are looking to enhance what they've done after fighting their way into the play-in. They're happy with what they have in Josh Giddey. Zion has played with Lonzo Ball, who the Bulls just gave an extension to as well. And they're familiar with each other and had success together as far as offense, but they don't have a star player. Zion could be in Chicago that star player. And his style of play is very similar to what they had when they had Derrick Rose there. Just a guy who's dynamic in the open court, who can, also handle the ball. Though I think that matchup is a little weird to have three guys, whether it's Lonzo, Giddy, and Zion. Like that's all people who want to have the ball in their hands and in order to control what's going on the floor. But certainly it could work, I guess. But do you have a lot of talent to give the Pelicans in return? I don't know. If you're talking about teams like the Minnesota Timberwolves, are you ending up with Julius Randle? New Orleans fans are already familiar with Julius Randle and weren't particularly excited about him when he was here. To get him back now, when you know that Julius, again, is an unhappy player, a guy who went from being a multiple time All Star with the Knicks, who ends up being a secondary player with the Timberwolves, and is not going to get the kind of money that he thought he was going to get with an extension with the Knicks originally. You're going to bring him back to New Orleans where he's not going to be happy. A good player, but not someone who elevates your franchise, who you've already seen before. I don't see it. I don't get it. Maybe the Pistons with Langdon, who's had already has a relationship with Zion in some way, and maybe he can salvage that and thinks that they can operate with Cade Cunningham in a pick and roll, and those two can become a dynamic duo. I think that they could. What do you take back? Are you ending up with a Tobias Harris, a guy who is not going to excite Pelicans fans, is not going to sell tickets, but is a dependable veteran? Are you excited about a lineup that enters the season with CJ McCollum, Trey Murphy, and Tobias Harris? Do you feel like that's a team that competes in the West? I don't think you do. So while you may be getting some of these players back, if you look at a team like the Toronto Raptors, there's nobody there that you want. You've already traded Brandon Ingram to them. You couldn't get anything back decent from them. You ended up with Bruce Brown, who should be walking in the offseason, and Kelly Olynyk, who's just a role player. You didn't even get good draft picks back. Not good ones. So where do you look? Where are these players going? You send them to Sacramento, maybe, to get Demonis Sabonis, who I think people are high on, but I would have been a lot higher on getting Demonis Sabonis, pairing him with Zion Williamson, than just having Sabonis. Because I think the issue is if you end up with Sabonis, um, your defense isn't better. Your offense is going to look good. Your rebounding is going to look good. But this team is a team that's just gave you the worst defensive team in Pelicans history, the worst net rating in the history of the franchise. And I've said several times that this was the worst season in franchise history. I don't care that the 2004-05 team had more losses. This team has been the worst team in the history of the franchise. Who are those other young, are there young players on Sacramento that you're excited about? Are there? Because you're not getting Zach LaVine. And would you want Zach LaVine, a guy with another injury history, to come back to you? An older player. There are not as many players and teams out there that look like great destinations to get Zion. If you go over and you try to get something from Portland, you end up with a bunch of young players that maybe pan out or maybe don't. Whatever is happening, if you end up trading Zion Williamson, the packages are not going to be interesting. And there's already rumors floating that hey, maybe they could trade him to the Lakers. For what? For what? What would you get from the Lakers and why? If you're trying to destroy the fan base, then go ahead and make that trade to the Lakers because you already have the animosity of trading Anthony Davis to the Lakers. You almost lost Chris Paul to the Lakers. It's like that. Those two franchises, the Pelicans and Lakers, Pelicans fans don't want anything to do with the Lakers. They don't want Laker players. If you're not getting back Austin Reeves, then the Pelicans don't want to hear that. And you think that they're going to give up Austin Reeves, whose contract is much cheaper than Zion Williamson, for Zion? I don't think so. Because to me, if you're looking for the long-term pairing of Luka Doncic and Austin Reeves, that makes more sense to me to have somebody who's a knockdown shooter around Luka Doncic, who's far more similar to the skill set that you saw with Kyrie Irving, a guy who can make shots from long distance and get into the paint with his ability to handle the basketball like Austin Reeves than you would be with an interior player like Zion Williamson. Luka can play with anybody, of course. But the one thing that Luka can't do is shoot really well. He doesn't shoot a high clip from the perimeter. Luka's a shot maker inside and has the ability to take people off the dribble and use his strength, but he's not a great outside shooter. Neither is Zion Williamson. So if you're the Lakers and you already have a team that doesn't shoot a lot from distance, why would you give up perhaps your best outside shooter in Austin Reeves to take on Zion Williamson and his injury history? It just doesn't make sense. So in my opinion, the Pelicans need to wait on making that decision. Allow Joe Dumars, if you're going to let him come in and have this responsibility, allow him to figure out what the best plan of action is. Because if the Pelicans have predetermined their courses of action already before they hire Joe Dumars, then that's probably a path to failure. The best thing you can do is allow Dumars, if this in this situation, is to come in and make the assessment. You can't do that from the NBA offices in New York. You got to come in and talk to people, get in the building, and make an assessment. And I think that's something that needs to be done over time. I'd rather the Pelicans take another year on that with Zion Williamson and ultimately trade him then if you want to do that. Trade him at the All-Star break, whatever, trade him at the end of next season than to do it this summer hastily just to say we're getting off the Zion Williamson narcotic. We're breaking cold turkey right now. You do that, and I think you're setting your franchise up for failure in the long term. And I say that because that's what NBA history has taught us. Time and time again, when you give up great players, it's very hard to get great players in the near future. Let's go back and look at NBA history, recent history. Let's just be fair because I like to do this recently, even though I could go back a lot further and show you these mistakes. When you lose a number one pick, it takes a long time for you to get a second chance at making it right when you punt on it and fail. So look, you go back to 2001. We go back all the way to 2001 with Kwame Brown. That's the Wizards missing on a number one pick. That made Michael Jordan have to come back. You know what I'm saying? Like the failure of Kwame Brown is what made Michael Jordan have to come back and try to fix the franchise just on the court and teach those guys how to win because it was such a mistake that he made in drafting Kwame Brown. The Houston Rockets drafted Yao Ming in 2002, and Yao was an exceptional player, a Hall of Fame basketball player, but his injuries set the franchise back. They set the franchise. It ultimately ended up to the breaking up of trying to make it work with Yao. They get rid of Steve Francis. They get rid of Cuttino Mobley. You end up bringing in Tracy McGrady. It never worked. The Rockets then had to eventually work their way to getting a James Harden through trade and then finding their way. But if you don't make the James Harden trade, still the Yao Ming era would have that failure of the Yao Ming era would have lasted. Of course, the next couple picks go really well. LeBron James, Dwight Howard, Andrew Bogut all did their jobs for their franchises. Bogut ends up, leaving in a more quiet manner due to injuries. But the Bucks by that time had Giannis Antetokounmpo and had figured out that Giannis was then their guy, a guy who wasn't drafted number one. The Raptors with Andre Bargnani, failure. Greg Oden, failure. Set their franchise back because of his injuries and having to move on from Greg Oden, the Trailblazer, and a number of other injuries, that they had at that time. Derrick Rose, what happened when the Bulls after the Derrick Rose era? How long? They're still trying to get back to that. The mediocrity that they've had in the years since Derrick Rose left. Blake Griffin, the Clippers fortunately have been able to rebuild for them, but losing Blake Griffin was a setback for them and they had to rebuild their organization. It took several years. The post John Wall Wizards, Kyrie Irving moving on to Boston after LeBron left. Those types of things. The Pelicans know it up close when Anthony Davis left. You're still you're now 7 years post Anthony Davis, and the Pelicans have two playoff series, to account for that since then. The Cavaliers, Anthony Bennett, Andrew Wiggins, all those things, all those failures. Minnesota Timberwolves move off of Karl Anthony Towns. They take a step back from being the number 2 seed in the West to being the number 7 seed in the West. This is what happens. You fall backwards. The Sixers, and the errors that they've made and the number one picks that the 76ers had, whether it was Markelle Fultz or Ben Simmons. How far did those failures set them back in trying to pair people with Joel Embiid and having to move on from both of those guys, a team that never advanced past the second round of the playoffs? The Phoenix Suns have already moved on past DeAndre Ayton, and the Suns now are about to have their fourth coach in 4 years and have only made one deep playoff run. So you can move on from your number one pick, but you do it at your own peril. And I think if you're the New Orleans Pelicans, when you are rarely in a position to attract talent in free agency, and it's not just because you're a small market, it's also because you're a poorly run franchise with a bad track record. It's the first domino to going into a full rebuild. That's fine. But I would say if you're going to do a full rebuild, don't predetermine that course. Let's see what happens at the lottery. If you end up with the number one pick and you want to build around Cooper Flagg, who I think would probably be like an evolutionary Scottie Pippen, then I think then a player who can do everything, who probably gives you 20 plus points, 7 rebounds, 5, 6 assists. Like, yeah, that's Cooper Flag could be that guy. But I don't want to bring in and make the same mistakes with a top pick that I did with Zion Williamson. You know what I mean? Like, you put that burden on Cooper Flag and say, look, we're going to give you a terrible roster of guys that we just, that we got back in the Zion Williamson trade, a bunch of people who are not going to be here very long, and you start the path of losing again. I don't think that that's the best decision for the Pelicans. And I don't think it's something that you can do with the fan base that already doesn't want to buy tickets, where people are canceling their season ticket, purchases, or deciding not to renew them, or have said that they won't buy tickets. And we saw that the public was not walking up and buying tickets this past season. There were a lot of nights in the arena where there were less than 10,000 people on hand. I don't care what the reports were that were given for attendance. There may have been purchased tickets, but those people were not in the building. And people just decided they weren't coming. And if you put another bad product on the court after you've done this season, after you've made a hire that isn't particularly popular today, even though people will, allow something to happen. If Joe Dumars comes in and wins, all is forgiven. Winning cures everything. People will forget about the process and how this happened if they win. But if they don't, they will never let you forget. And I think Pelicans fans feel like they've been burned enough. So to take away, as frustrating as Zion Williamson has been on the court, as frustrating as he has been off the court, to give up on him now, in my opinion, again, is a mistake. It's a mistake. As frustrated as you might be watching right now and saying, Grubb, Zion is not that guy, you got to move on. Who are you getting better? Who are you getting that's better than him in free agency? Who are you getting better than him in a trade? Who are you getting that elevates the floor and your ceiling at the same time? Your worst isn't that bad with Zion, and your best is really, really good. Your best is really, really good. And if there's one thing that you know in the postseason is that you have to have a player who can be the best player in a series to win a championship. Pelicans don't have that player on the roster if his name isn't Zion Williamson. It's not Trey Murphy just yet. And what you also do is you reset your timeline. If you're going to do a rebuild, that means Trey Murphy has to be traded. That means Herb Jones has to be traded. That means Jose Alvarado has to be traded because all of these guys are now in their mid-20s. And if I'm going back to start with a 19-year-old, whether it's Dylan Harper, whether it's Cooper Flag, I'm not going to say Ace Bailey because the more I watch Ace Bailey, the less I'm intrigued to like him. He feels like a guy who's just going to stay out on the perimeter and not put the ball on the floor. He's not going to give you many rebounds at 6'10". He's not going to do, the dirty work. He doesn't feel like a winner to me. I could be wrong, but Ace Bailey doesn't feel like a winner to me. And none of the other guys in this draft are going to come in and be immediately the guy. They all need time. And you look around this Pelicans roster, do you see guys, do you see enough players who could develop a young player? Because they couldn't do it this year. So I think that if you're going to go on a full rebuild, I think waiting one more year just to see if it's the right plan is probably the smartest thing to do. And when I say one more year, I mean you can adjust, of course, once the season starts. But I'd like to see the opportunity. I think that many people agree that the biggest failure with Zion was just that the leadership from the front office didn't get on him early enough and say, this is what we demand of you and expect of you. I think that was on David Griffin. I've said it. The original sins with Zion was that you didn't have the right coach. You didn't put the right structure around him. You didn't demand accountability early. You wait till year 6 to suspend him for being late to a plane trip. That stuff should have been done in year 1 and taken care of, and you put him on the path to discipline. And now you're going to send in a new teacher and say, we're going to suspend the kids and expel them from school. You're trying to be Joe Clark up in here instead of Joe Dumars. You want to clean up East Side High just by throwing people out of school. And ultimately, that's not what works. Because if you know the real story about what happened at East Side High, the school was still bad. Joe Clark got fired. School didn't get cleaned up. A movie is one thing, but in reality, simply throwing out what you perceive as the bad kids does not fix the ultimate structure. And I think that's what the New Orleans Pelicans are trying to do. That's what Gail Benson is trying to do. She thinks that if she gets rid of what she doesn't like to her eye, that everything will be all right. And that's not how this works. You can fix people, you can get them to conform if you set the right expectations and you have a respectful agreement between adults. Zion Williamson is still 24 years old. 24 years old. There was a time in the NBA where that was still very young. And you can say, well, that's not that time anymore. People are still people and they got to mature. Yeah, you enter the workforce, you take on work responsibilities. Absolutely. And I think Zion has to grow up. I think he took some steps this season to growing up. I think his commitment on defense was better. I think his commitment to his fitness was better. Yes, there's still mistakes, but those mistakes are part of the reason that you're here, and that's you're accountable for those things too. And if you just want to admit that you failed and then put all the onus on the other guy and get rid of him, I think that that's a bad way to do business. I'd like to see if Joe Dumars get the opportunity to come in and meet with Zion Williamson and some of these other players as well. Because I think of Trey Murphy, who plays well off of Zion Williamson, Herb Jones, who plays well with Zion Williamson. Both of those guys, the career numbers show that they play very well with Zion Williamson. If I'm Trey Murphy, I want to know how this is going to impact my career. Because no Zion Williamson means I'm going to go through another season of losing. And that's pretty much what I know in my career. I've never been higher than eighth in the West. Never. Do I want to do that after I just got my extension? And the Pelicans say, well, we just signed you. You ain't going anywhere. But if I don't want to be here, you're not going to want me here very long. Now, I'm not saying Trey is going to do that, but what I'm saying is players start looking at their careers and what their options are and what their timetables look like. And if there are opportunities in other places to do better, then I'd want to do better. But we shall see. We shall see. But ultimately, the fact of the matter is, Joe Dumars is now the executive vice president of basketball operations, and there's a lot of work to be done in order to make the New Orleans Pelicans a contender. All right, y'all, hit that like button, that subscribe button, drop your comments below. I appreciate you as always. You can follow me on social media, and don't forget to check out thebirdrights.com for more news and information about the New Orleans Pelicans. Y'all be good.